Thank you for joining us today for our May Lunch and Learn. I'm glad everybody could be here. I am Julie Brown. I'm the Raptor Migration and Programs Director at HMA. And I'm joined today by Phil Brown. He is the Director of Bird Conservation at the Harris Center for Conservation Education here in New Hampshire. And you can let us know where you're joining from in the chat. We always like to hear from you and where you're tuning in from. Maybe add an exciting bird sighting that you've had this week. For me, I saw a mother black bear, not a bird, but a mother black bear and two tiny, tiny babies yesterday. So that made my week for sure. We are very excited to welcome Zoe Bonerbo to Lunch and Learn, who has been researching prairie falcons. Migration-wise, it's a species we don't often hear too much about at HMA because we don't have that many sites monitoring them during migration. She's going to be talking about her master's research, assessing behavioral variation among prairie falcons in a rapidly changing dryland ecosystem. So before Phil gives an introduction to Zoe, I'll give you just a little bit of background on HMA if you're new to us. We're a nonprofit that provides support to the Raptor Migration Monitoring Network across the Americas. And there are about 200 active hawkwatch sites throughout North, Central, and South America that monitor migration during the spring and fall and report that data to our database hawkcount.org. So we provide a lot of resources to the monitoring network and a number of annual grants to help hawkwatch sites and raptor research efforts. We also have a lot of educational resources like Hawk ID materials, and we're part of the RPI, the Raptor Population Index, which provides conservation assessments and population trend analyses using hawk count long-term migration data. So you can learn more about what we do at hawkmigration.org or check out our database, hawkcount.org. We are recording as usual. We're live streaming on Facebook, on our Facebook page, and you can view any of our Lunch and Learn programs on that Facebook page or afterwards on our website. And we're muting everybody today, but we'd love to engage with you through the chat. So you can enter your questions in there for Zoe, and Phil will read them to her at the end. And lastly, if you don't already receive our e-newsletter, you can sign up. It usually goes out about twice a month, so you can add your name to the chat, and I will sign you up. All right, take it away, Phil.
Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome Zoe Bonerbo. Zoe holds a bachelor's degree in environmental and wildlife biology from McGill University. She is currently a master's of Raptor Biology student at Boise State University. Prior to beginning her master's, she worked as the lab and research manager for the Quantitative Conservation Lab for 2 years, overseeing ground squirrel and jackrabbit field research. Additionally, she has a history of working seasonal positions, including as the assistant crew lead on the University of Florida's Snail Kite Project, raptor migration monitoring with Hawk Mountain Sanctuary and Hawkwatch International, and as a volunteer bird bander at the Intermountain Bird Observatory. Go ahead, Zoe.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here today. I think prairie falcons are underrepresented, and I'm really, really excited to be able to talk about them. So my plan for today is to first go into a bit of natural history and then discuss some of the former and current research that's happening. And I'm adapting this presentation from my presentation that I gave at the Raptor Research Foundation conference in the fall. And so I hope you all enjoy. So we're going to dive right in. We have prairie falcons occurring primarily through western North and Central America. So they're a species with a relatively small range compared to maybe some of the raptor species that we think of here in North America. They are not these crazy long distant migrants. They stay pretty compacted through desert grassland ecosystems where they hunt, and they need cliff walls, rocky cliffs, in order to be able to nest. So we find them in these high elevation, open plateau regions that are able to sustain prey populations in the grassland and desert areas, and then are able to provide roosting and nesting habitat through cliff faces and rocks. We do have a population of them here in Idaho, and that's primarily what I'll be focusing on today. So I'll dive into that a little bit later. Let's talk about their breeding. So right now we're in the midst of their breeding season, which occurs from March through July. I currently have field technicians that are out monitoring nests, and we actually call these nests scrapes. And so the reason that we call them scrapes is because they don't build their own nests traditionally. They don't build a stick nest. They actually either take over a nest that's already been built by a red-tailed hawk or a raven or a golden eagle and is not being used for the season by other species. They'll take over that stick nest, or they will just lay their eggs directly on the rock. Similar to pigeons and how pigeons roost on cliff faces. So a few examples in these photos are on the bottom left, you can see a pair of prairies that have taken over a stick nest, while the other three images show examples of prairies that have just laid their eggs directly on the rocks. They lay an average of 5 eggs. However, throughout my research, I've seen anywhere from 2 to 6 be fairly regular. And they are able to keep them from rolling off by, you can see they create little depressions in the rock, and honestly, they kind of just use accumulated poop to keep eggs from rolling off of the nest. They will incubate for about 29 to 39 days. This can vary a bit by region, as well as if the birds are captive or if they are in the wild. So for us in our region, it's about an average of 35 days. Both the male and the female will tend to the nest during this time. The male on average incubates for about a third of the entire nesting period. And the female does about 2/3, but they will nest swap and incubate. When the chicks have hatched, they fledge in about 38 to 40 days. So this is a little timeline of one of our nests from last year as the babies were growing up. We have nest cameras that we've placed on a number of nests, which I'll talk about more towards the end of the presentation. So that's how we were able to capture these photos, very low disturbance. And as you can see, they grow up. They're very, very cute to watch grow up. The babies, when they're small, cannot thermoregulate until they're about 11 days old. So the parents will still brood them and you'll see them frequently on and around the nest until they're about 11 days old, which is when the parents will slowly start to leave more consistently and give them space. And as the babies get older, the parents will only come back to feed prey and defend from predators. Once they get to this range of about 30 to 37 days old is when you start seeing them also wandering around the cliff face. So once they can stand and once they can walk, they are very mobile. And the ledges along cliff faces makes it really easy for them to hop between different points. So once they get to these older stages, you'll often see that they run off camera and they go explore, and then they come back to the scrape location when food comes in or when a parent comes back, because that's where they know that food is going to be dropped. And then once they reach about 40 days old, that is when they actually are able to start flying, and you see them take their first fledging steps. They do stick around post-fledging with the parents for another about 30 to 40 days in order to learn and understand how to hunt and things like that. So you'll see them in the area occupying the territory for about 30 to 40 days after they fledge. During this time too, the parents become less aggressive. So we oftentimes will have pairs that nest very close to each other. And you'll see that the babies from the different nests will hang out together. These nest scrapes, for relative reference, we can have scrapes that are as close as 30 meters apart. Some of our largest scrapes, though, or our largest territories, are about 1 kilometer in size. So there's a big fluctuation in terms of how large their actual territory is that they're defending and occupying. The next thing I want to talk about is diet. So one of the things I just mentioned is that the babies stick around the area because that's where food is dropped. So what are they eating? So they are one of the few falcons that specialize on small mammals. Most falcons are either generalists or they specialize in birds, but prairie falcons really primarily hunt what's called the ground squirrels, the Paiute ground squirrel within our study area. And we'll talk about that more later and some of the diet behaviors. However, you'll notice in some of these videos, we also have a lizard in the bottom right corner being delivered. We also do see birds, starlings primarily, as well as house sparrows that get delivered. So you're looking at small creatures because prairie falcons are a little bit smaller than peregrine falcons. And they can't hunt super large mammals like jackrabbits, but they do go for ground squirrels primarily because ground squirrels are one of the few mammals that are active during the day. And then sometimes they'll get other things like kangaroo rats or voles or mice in the area as well. And then they supplement that with birds and reptiles. Now, once prairie falcons are done breeding and they've left their breeding range, they actually go follow the ground squirrels. And I'll show you more about this later, but they do an interesting northern migration where they, instead of going south, go north in the late summer or midsummer in order to follow the ground squirrels, because the ground squirrels will estivate when it's too hot out and they will disappear underground. Ground squirrels don't hibernate in the winter. Instead, they hibernate or estivate during the summer. And so if you go up to either higher latitudes or higher elevations, the ground squirrels have not gone underground yet because it's not too hot for them. So the prairie falcons, when they leave their natal and their breeding grounds, will actually go north or go to higher elevation to catch more ground squirrels that haven't gone underground there yet. All right, so I'm going to jump into why we study them here in Idaho. So our little study area is called the Morley Nelson Birds of Prey National Conservation Area. I will just call it the NCA for the rest of this presentation because that is a mouthful. And they are breeding along miles and miles of cliff face that occur within this habitat and this conservation area. It also hosts very dense concentrations of ground squirrels and other prey species throughout the grassland landscapes above the cliffs. And the population of breeding prairie falcons here has been shown to actually been increasing from the 1990s, where it was about a little under 200 pairs, around 200 pairs, to about 300 pairs in the most recent full canyon survey that was done in 2021. And so it's the densest known concentration of breeding prairie falcons, as well as of raptors in general in the lower 48 states that we know of. So it's a incredible habitat, not only for prairie falcons, but for red-tailed hawks, for ferruginous hawks, for golden eagles, Swainson's hawks, as well as a new number of owl species and others. And so there's a lot of dedicated research that happens in this NCA conservation area. For reference, Boise is underneath the Surveys in Idaho sign that I put up here. But Boise is about a 45-minute drive north of this conservation area. So it's super, super accessible for research and super accessible to scientists. It is an area managed for multi-purposes. So it is a BLM-owned conservation area, which means that recreation is allowed in this area. And you'll see that there's this OCTC area, which is essentially a military training ground. So it is the only conservation area that is owned by BLM, Bureau of Land Management, that also hosts a national conservation and a military base on it. So the Idaho National Guard is actually a partner that we work very closely with, and their researchers and scientists are out there also diligently doing work. They are one of our funding sources for this project. So we have a good working relationship with them. And as you can see, this area is situated in southwestern Idaho in the United States. So it is in the western United States, right in the center of where a lot of prairie falcons live and exist. So within this conservation area, the habitat is about 500,000 acres of sagebrush dryland. However, it's experienced a lot of change. So environmental change is occurring globally, especially for dryland ecosystems. And in dryland ecosystems have been dictated as endangered in many areas. And so a large majority of the issues we see here are increasing wildfire and encroachment of invasive plants. So you can see in the bottom left corner is a photo of the sagebrush steppe that has been burnt due to wildfire. And then you can see in the bottom right is a photo where there's been encroachment of invasive cheatgrass as well as invasive tumble mustards. And so this has crowded out some of the sagebrush as well as destroyed some of these mosaic landscapes. And so there's a lot of restoration efforts and a lot of research going into how is this environmental impact affecting the local wildlife. So one of the things that the cruise lab that I am a part of has been doing that I have also looked at is ground squirrel abundance. So we talked before that ground squirrels were one of the key prey species for prairie falcons. And the Snake River Plains ground squirrel, also known as the Paiute ground squirrel, they were recently separated into new taxonomic groups, and that is waiting to be validated. We have surveys that date back to the 1970s for ground squirrel abundance in the NCA. And so this is on the figure on the right is a map of time on the x-axis and ground squirrel density on the y-axis, showing relative abundance of ground squirrels throughout the NCA over time. And you can see right now, this period post-COVID is a depression, is a very low point in their population. And so this is potentially cause for concern for what's going to happen to the prairie falcons and the other species that prey on them. One of the big differences that we're seeing right now is that they are not rebounding, these ground squirrels are not rebounding in ways that they have previously. So in past years, if you look at the 70s and 80s, you'll see that there's a dip there, but that they spiked back up pretty quickly. We unfortunately are not seeing that spike back up and increase in growth. We're seeing that they've plateaued a little bit and are not currently decreasing further, but more work needs to be done to evaluate the extent to which this population can survive current modern day changes. So the thing that I wanted to investigate is how are prairie falcons responding to this? So we know from papers historically that have studied prairie falcons that the birds are able to adapt to changes and fluctuations in ground squirrel abundance. One of the papers that came out in the 90s by Marsleff et al. Demonstrated that the prairie falcon populations fluctuated kind of cyclically and naturally with ground squirrels. However, what we don't know, because one of the things they didn't explore within that is how much individuals changed individually. So one of the things that they did was summarize population level estimates, which is great for understanding how the population as a whole is doing, but it doesn't give us the capacity to understand how they may adapt to future changes. So this leads me into behavioral variation. So behavioral variation is the different behaviors exhibited amongst individuals within a population, and having this behavioral variation at different scales, so either among individuals or within individuals, which I'll talk a bit about both, can help enhance resilience and buffer the population against environmental change. So for example, among individual variation is variation that's exhibited between individuals within a population. And what this looks like over time, over the course of 3 different years, is that you will have mammal specialists within a population. You might have bird specialists within a population. You have these differences in behavioral composition. And these different individuals that compose the population are able to respond to differences in the environment and keep the population strong. So in year 1, where you have both abundant bird and mammal prey items, both the mammal specialists and the bird specialists kind of occur in equal fashions. In year 2, when you have primarily abundant mammal prey available, the mammal specialists do better and they buffer the population. And then in year 3, the bird specialists do better and buffer the population when there's abundant birds and less mammals. And this is a simplification of the process, but has been demonstrated to be effective in multiple literature reviews. This can also happen at a different scale. So this can also happen within an individual, which is called individual plasticity. So that's the within individual variation in response to fluctuating environmental conditions. So like our example from before, instead of having separate individuals that do different things, you have one individual that can prey switch, essentially. So you can have an individual that eats both mammals and birds in an abundant bird and mammal year. And then this one individual has plasticity or flexibility to switch to only eating mammals in year 2, and then has the plasticity or flexibility or adaptability to switch to just eating birds in year 3, depending on the prey composition in its environment. So having these levels of variation, behavioral variation, has been demonstrated to have several benefits. It can reduce competition, both within the species as well as with other species in the area. It can diversify access to different resources. So you can think about our prey example from before, but this can also mean water, this can mean shelter, and it can also regulate risk exposure. So it can decrease exposure to poachers and predators. It can decrease exposure to pathogens. And so having flexibility and this behavioral diversity can be really, really helpful to the population as a whole. We wanted to apply some of these concepts to prairie falcons to see not only what the population level is doing, but what individuals are doing that may explicitly help them survive some of the environmental changes that I talked about previously. For my first chapter, we are primarily doing this by examining their movement and diversity in their movement strategies. So movement is the link between an animal and its environment. Its ability to access resources that we talked about before, its ability to expand its home range, or its ability to acquire food, all of these things, especially for birds, is linked through movement. So we wanted to understand how prairie falcons express variability in their home range size and in their resource selection for different habitat types. And specifically, we wanted to look at among individual differences and within individual differences. So we did that for the home range, the 2 different scales. For resource selection for their habitat type, we didn't have the enough fine scale resolution data to explore individual plasticity or the within individual component. So we're only looking at the among individual differences for that part. And what we're hoping to find is that prairie falcons show large variability. So I predict that these things will be high for all of them in order for these prairie falcons to be able to consistently adapt to the changes that are happening, especially because we know that their breeding populations have increased along this area over the last 50 years. We really truly want to understand to what degree is behavioral variation maybe contributing to that. There have been a lot of studies that have shown declines of prairie falcons in other regions. And so maybe by introducing some variation into other populations, there could be a mechanism for promoting conservation of other populations and species. So how did we do this for movement? Well, we deployed a total of 19 transmitters in 2021 and 2022. 9 of those transmitters collected data in 2021. 15 of those transmitters collected data in 2022. 9 collected data in 2023, and 5 collected data in 2024. And then we used autocorrelated kernel density estimators in order to calculate the 95% home range estimates. We use integrated step selection functions to model the resource selection. We had within that random intercepts and random slopes for the vegetation type. So we determined habitat by vegetation type, as well as we factored in things like step length, turning angle, altitude, and territory to see how those influenced resource selection. So I'm not going to get too much more into the methodologies. We're going to skip straight to the results, but this is an example of what one of the transmitters looks like on the back of a Prairie Falcon. It fits very slim. They are solar paneled, and they are through cellular tracking technologies. They relay data via satellite to us and check in once a day. And we currently still have 2 working transmitters, which I'll talk more about at the end. But our results. So this is an example of the largest and smallest home ranges that we documented for known breeding birds. And you can see just how large this discrepancy is, from 2.14 kilometers squared all the way up to 871 approximately kilometers squared. We actually had an individual who had a home range even larger than this, but we could not confirm if they were a breeding individual. So we excluded them from analysis. And so these are specifically for individuals who we know had a breeding attempt confirmed in the year that the satellite transmitter was put on. I'm going to show you next the graph of all of the territories. So what you can see here is highlighted our smallest and largest home range again on this graph, and you can see a pretty good dispersal of intermittent values in between. You see a majority of individuals had these smaller home range sizes, with a few individuals that had these large spikes. Now, one thing to note is from the literature, all I could find was that the largest home ranges reported were 415 kilometers squared prior to this analysis. And we had 4 birds that we included in this analysis that had home ranges higher. We also had a number of birds who were confirmed not nesting, or that we didn't know whether or not they didn't nest, who we did not include in this analysis, who had even larger home ranges. So the 415 kilometers squared, if anybody on this call is watching, if anybody knows of any larger documented home range sizes that haven't been reported in the literature that may exist in unpublished data, please feel free to reach out to me, because I find it very curious that 4 of our individuals have larger home ranges than that. And I am interested to know, and one thing that we haven't explored yet that would be interesting for future research, is to what degree the habitat change and the ground squirrel composition is maybe driving some of these larger home ranges. If we are currently in a period where there's low ground squirrel abundance, is that causing individuals to have to travel further to find food? And is that driving these increases in some of their home range size? We did not determine that year had a significant effect on home range size. Sex had a minor effect. Males had larger home ranges than females overall, but we had a very small sample size of males compared to females, so we take that result with a little bit of caution. So this is the specifically among individual variation. Next, I'm going to switch to talking about the within individual variation. So how much does one individual fluctuate in their home range size between years? So we had 12 individuals that had multiple years of data. This is an example of 6 of those individuals. And what you can see is each color on each of these little plots, each plot is our study area, and each color on each plot is a different year. You can see that their home ranges, the colors for each individual, overlap quite substantially. So what this means is that there's very low individual plasticity within their home ranges. So an individual does not change where it's foraging, where it's traveling outside of its nesting area, much at all. We also noticed that of all the individuals that had multiple years of data and returned, they all returned to the same territory or an adjacent territory. So they were not traveling to the other side of the study area in order to breed. They were very specific to coming back and very site fidelic to the previous territories that they had used before. The exception to this, which is kind of a little bit of a side tidbit, is that even if they use the same territory that they did before, they very rarely use the same scrape that they used in the previous year. So they would switch the scrape or the nest that they were using, even if they were reusing the same territory. But you can see for some of these individuals, their territories overlap almost perfectly year after year. And they really do not show a whole lot of variation in the home range size that they're using between years. And so this is interesting because it means that there's a discrepancy between the two scales. What we're seeing is that there's high variation between individuals in the population, but low variation within an individual. So selection pressures may work differently depending on the scale that it's working at. This is also some bonus results, but since this is a hawk migration association, I wanted to talk a little bit about their movement patterns outside of their breeding ranges. So this is an example of 2 individuals, and the red star is our study area. So that's the location of our study area. All of the different lines that you see are different years that the bird has been tracked. And it is all of the movements that it has done throughout multiple years. So you can see for the individual on the left here, this individual year after year is traveling from the Boise, Idaho area all the way up to southern Canada and back down to a little bit northwest of Boise every single year, and it follows the same migration paths. Each year it does this as well. So these are the non-breeding ranges, and I'm not calling them wintering ranges because, as I discussed before, prairie falcons actually do this northern migration during the summer when ground squirrels have disappeared because it's gotten too hot in our study area. So we're calling these non-breeding ranges, and these non-breeding ranges you can see have every single year they return to the same non-breeding ranges. For this individual, it's using the same migration paths as it does that. For this individual on the right, you can see it returns to the same non-breeding areas year after year, these large clusters of dots, but it does not use the same migration paths. So while they seem to be very site fidelic to their breeding and non-breeding grounds, and there's low individual plasticity with that, it seems to be variable by individual, either low to moderate plasticity in their migration routes. So some individuals seem to have more flexibility in the migration routes that they use, while some individuals seem to be very set in their migration paths. And you can see for this individual, it is also moving north primarily, but it also has these large western and eastern movements that it does. It travels very far year after year. Only one bird out of all 19 that had transmitters did any southern migration movement. And it went southeast to Nebraska. I'm not entirely sure what's out in Nebraska that it liked, but almost all of our other individuals moved north in the mid to late summer, and then would either for the winter over in east or west latitudes, or they would come back to the conservation area to winter. So we're going to jump into now from home range and movement migration to resource selection results. So for resource selection, we're also looking at what is the level of variability for the resources that they're selecting for. And the reason we want to do this is because, as I will point out in a minute, at the population level, when we tried to average it, it seems like they were not selecting for anything. And it seemed like habitat wasn't important. So we're going to walk through these results. On the x-axis, we have what I'm calling surrounding mean cover. Essentially what this is the difference in vegetation cover for each of the individuals. On the y-axis is the resource selection strength. So that is how much an animal either preferred that vegetation cover type or how much it avoided it. If an individual did not have a preference, that is an individual dot that falls within those two lines where you see I highlighted in red. Any individual that falls within those lines is using the habitat in relation to its availability, is the fancy way of saying that statistically. But it essentially means that they don't have a preference one way or another for that habitat type. The three different habitat types that we looked at were annual, perennial, and shrub. So annual herbaceous cover, perennial herbaceous cover, and shrub cover. Annual herbaceous cover is primarily associated with invasives and non-native species here in our conservation area, while perennial and shrub cover are primarily associated with native species. So historically, you might predict that a species that has evolved with native plants would preferentially select for that. However, we had some mixed results. So for annual, what we saw was we have this individual in orange all the way up at the top here who really strongly selected for this annual herbaceous vegetation type. In contrast, a majority of individuals either had no preference for this habitat type or selected against it. So we had this one major outlier, and we actually, as part of this study, didn't want to remove these outliers or summarize it in a population level fashion. We wanted to look at the difference between this highest to lowest result. This black line, these dark black lines along the x-axis, this represents the population level mean. So you can see that for annual, this dark black line falls within our boundaries for consideration of no preferential selection. And so when you summarized it at the population level, it looked like annuals didn't matter. But when you actually look at it closer, it seems a majority of individuals are avoiding annual, and there are few individuals that do actually select for annual. This may be due to differences in dietary preference, which I can expand on more later, or what's available to them within their foraging areas. For perennial, what we found is that a majority of individuals strongly avoided perennial, which was an interesting result for us. We would have primarily expected the opposite of that. A majority of individuals would select for perennial since these are native species. However, a majority avoided it in this situation. For shrub, we see a pretty good mix. So we see that those who had lower amounts of shrub within their home ranges, so you can see those that had anywhere from 0 to 4% shrub within their home range and around their tracks, they primarily avoided shrub. However, those that had mid-levels of shrub, which is what is typically associated with the healthiest habitats in our conservation area, those individuals either had no preference or selected for shrub. So what we think might be happening here is that those who have low amounts of shrub in their habitat may be avoiding shrub because it may not actually play a role in supporting prey populations. Those that have ideal shrub compositions within and around their tracks may be selecting for shrub because ideal habitat types are better at supporting prey compositions that they hunt for. However, within all of this, what we are interested in is the fact that there is such a large discrepancy between an individual selecting for shrub and an individual selecting against shrub. When you average this at the population level, again, it looks like shrub is not important to these individuals. But when you actually think about it in terms of a conservation standpoint, it seems like shrub that are at healthy values are actually, in fact, benefiting the population. So decomposing it into these individual level metrics has given us a much better picture of how some of this landscape change may be affecting our prairie falcon behaviors. So overall, summarizing these results, we found high among individual differences in home range size, but we did not find high individual differences in individual plasticity. And so what this says is that at the population level, they may be what's called hedging their bets. So they may be able to hedge their bets across different environmental landscapes and environmental fluctuations by having selection pressures occur for different individuals in different years, instead of having one individual adapt to each type of environmental condition. You have multiple individuals that some of them do better in some years, while others do better in other years, instead of having all individuals changing their style across different years. For resource selection, we also found high among individual differences for that, and a further area of exploration would be looking at the within individual differences or individual plasticity. So this leads me into some of our next steps. So one of the things that we predict is that diet is driving some of these individual differences in addition to behavioral variability. We actually are going to explore that for my chapter 2. So we're combining our telemetry data. You can see this bird on the left is the male, and he has a telemetry device on him. The female has a starling in the background here, prey item that she's delivering to all of her nestlings. And so I really love this photo because it encapsulates kind of all of the work that we're doing. We're going to be combining and looking at how some of these movements are coupled with the diet and prey deliveries that are coming back to the nest. So we're going to look at if the diet and prey deliveries fluctuate for different individuals with different home ranges. And then we're also going to look at how this diet and prey deliveries brought to the nest affect nestling survival. And so we're able to do this using nest cameras that we install on all of our nests. So the photos that I showed before, the timeline of the nest, things like that, all of those photos come from nest cameras that we have installed at the scrape. And they capture that diet variation as well as the nestling survival for us. Some of the preliminary results for diet very quickly. This is from our 2023 cameras. And very preliminarily, what we can see is for 4 different territories along the x-axis, the percent of prey composition varied quite a bit. We had anywhere from 33% ground squirrels in red, this red-orange color, all the way up to 79% ground squirrel composition delivered to the nestlings at the nest. And you can see that 3 out of the 4 nests, all of the nests had mammals and had ground squirrel prey deliveries. 3 out of the 4 nests had bird prey deliveries, and 2 out of the 4 nests had reptile deliveries. And very preliminarily looking at, I don't have a graph for it yet, but looking at our 2024 and 2025 data, they are showing very similar trends where some of the nests have reptiles and birds, but all of the nests have ground squirrels. A majority of the nests have birds, only some of the nests have reptiles. So you can see that some nests and some parents are hunting other prey items that may be influencing their home range size. It may be influencing nestling survival and productivity, and may be driving some of these differences that we're seeing. Some additional findings that we have gotten from our cameras just for fun. One of the things that we, as a subsequent nature of the cameras, are able to see are predation risks and predation rates. So prairie falcons have been predated by ravens. They've been predated by golden eagles at the nest, and we've captured some of this on camera. One of our novel findings is that we captured the first fox predating a prairie falcon nest. And it predated it at the egg stage. So this is a red fox that has an egg in its mouth that just came out of the prairie falcon scrape on the left here, where all this white is. And the parents survived. However, unfortunately, it took all of the eggs. But foxes are a previously unknown nest predator of prairie falcons. So this was a really cool documentation. One of the other findings that we had was the displacement of a prairie falcon pair by barn owl antagonism. So primarily, prairie falcons have been demonstrated in the literature to be the aggressors whenever interacting with barn owls and have been the primary winners. In this situation, we documented on camera a nest attempt by prairie falcons that was abandoned because barn owls came and harassed the prairie falcons night after night until eventually one of the eggs cracked and the prairie falcon pair abandoned the scrape. The barn owl pair that had babies that were nesting only about 3 meters away, they were very, very close by, ended up occupying the scrape, and their babies moved in and took over. And so this is the first known example of American barn owls winning against prairie falcons in this scenario. We do have a publication coming out about this in the Journal of Raptor Research. It's a short article that you should see this summer. So you're welcome to follow up with it this summer when that gets published. So I do want to thank a number of collaborators and research partners for all of this work. It could not have happened without a number of people who came before me, as well as a number of people who've been helping me throughout the season. So I thank my committee who has supervised me for this master's research, as well as all of the people who have given additional support and funding for this project. And I want to open it up to any questions that people might have.
Well, thanks so much, Zoe. That was really a fascinating look at a species that a lot of us probably don't know so well because of the places that they like to nest. Yeah, we got a few questions here, and I'll jump right into those. I'll start with a comment Julie made about how surprised she was the proximity in which they nest, 30 meters apart. Is there any thought about why? Is it a lack of nest sites? Any thoughts on that?
That is a great question. Yeah, it's definitely not due to a lack of nest sites. There are miles and miles and stretches of canyon where you will not find any prairie falcons, and then you'll find a cluster of them in one spot that they seem to really like. So some of our smallest clusters are occurring in an area called Crater Rings, and it's essentially a collapsed lava tunnel that has formed a massive ring in the ground that has cliff face on it. That's how big this crater is. You can walk into the bottom of it and survey really well. You can drive around the rim and survey. And so those are where some of our smallest proximities are, is this kind of circular loop of a ring where all the birds, there's usually 3 to 4 pairs in a single ring, and they've all carved out, a third of the ring, and they are all in this kind of circular area together. We have had cases of birds that are nesting on a cliff face where one pair is like an upstairs neighbor and another pair is a downstairs neighbor. So some of these cliff faces have multiple tiers, and you'll get pairs that occupy, in one situation, they occupied an upstairs and a downstairs tier and were patrolling and had a really wide territory, but really narrow. And then whenever one of the pairs had to fly from the downstairs pair, had to fly up, it would always get escorted out by the upstairs pair. I would be fascinated to know more about why they do it that way. Because some of our largest territories consistently are about 1 kilometer in size. And that seems like a lot for a prairie falcon, 1 kilometer in size, compared to like a bird like a golden eagle that is much larger, and it makes more sense for them to have more space. But for the prairie falcons, I I don't know if we know what drives it yet. I would be really interested to know more.
Maybe they gang up and attack potential nest predators. Has anybody watched
Potentially,
that?
yeah, there could be a level of like they nest very close to ravens and barn owls, which we know now are antagonists. Ravens have also definitely predated. So that could definitely be if there's multiple pairs in the area, either disperse some of that predation risk or mean that there are multiple pairs that are not encouraging nesting of other species. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Staying on the home range question, you did mention that there was a slight discrepancy maybe with between male and female
Mhm.
as far as home range sizes. Um,
Yeah,
is
I
there
think
is there any way to break that down a little more?
I think I have a slide on this. Let's see. Okay, yeah, we have a slide on this. Some bonus content. So the female and males, it looks like we have a lot more female and male birds than we do on this plot because it has multiple years of data for each individual. We only had 6 males. However, you can see that we have a pretty good spread of males across the entire distribution of the conservation area. And we have a pretty good spread of females across the distribution of the conservation area. However, we have more females in this northwestern area and more males in this southeastern area. And so because the conservation area is more narrowly limited in this southeastern area than this northwestern area, it may be influencing some of the home range sizes a little bit in terms of the capacity that they have to move through these areas. But primarily, we found that on average, males were larger than females. Females do a majority. So part of this may be driving this, maybe the fact that males do a majority of the hunting during incubation, and they do incubate for a little bit, but the females are the primary incubating birds. And our transmitter data, which runs from March through about mid-July, end of June every year, for the breeding season, is capturing females during 30 days when they're primarily incubating on eggs. So males we usually get more points for, so we can estimate their home range sizes. It's probably a little bit of a more clear picture as their home range sizes because they're not incubating as much as the females. But I do think that females are sticking closer to the nest overall and are not, during the breeding season at least, they are not expending as much energy going out and foraging. We do see that females expand their home range the later during the breeding season it gets. So we did break this down by week, which I don't have a figure for. But when you break it down by week, you see that females expand their range quite a bit more when their babies have fledged and when they're able to be more independent. So I think a lot of this is driven by breeding season. And for individuals that are not nesting, for the females that are not nesting, they probably show very similar ranges to the males. Our individual that had the largest home range that we've ever documented is a female. This is her home range. So she actually nested way outside of our study area. This is the Owyhee Mountain Ranges. And she would traverse about 50 kilometers a day into our conservation area to forage. And so we excluded her from analysis because we could never guarantee if she was breeding or not. And yeah, so there's a lot of variation between individuals. And so summarizing it at the average level of saying males have on average a larger home range size than the females is consistent with most literature around raptors in general, but it kind of excludes some of these really cool cases where our largest home range size was a female that was traveling from outside the conservation area into the conservation area. So,
Neat.
yeah.
Thanks. Okay. Well, we have a couple of questions about habitat and prey. So we'll start with one from Christina. about does prairie falcon habitat utilize cattle grazing areas at all?
hmm Yeah, so there's a lot of overlap in our conservation area with cattle grazing. So yes, it does overlap quite heavily. There's also some agricultural areas that border our conservation area. And we think that they utilize the agricultural areas primarily in years with more or with less ground squirrel abundance because ground squirrels also sometimes rely on the agricultural areas. However, pairs that forage on starlings or lizards or things outside of ground squirrels may also more heavily utilize the agricultural areas because those are dense concentrations of starlings, house sparrows, things like that. And yeah, cattle grazing is talked about a lot in this conservation area. I didn't include it as a factor for um, one of the reasons that before that we pull back up this here. I didn't talk about it as one of the factors that is affecting the landscape, but we do have areas that have been trampled quite a bit by cattle grazing. And the landscape has been restructured by cattle grazing in certain areas in this conservation area. And so to what effect it impacts the ground squirrel abundance, I'm not sure. But prairie falcons, I mean, just from anecdotal visual observation, they definitely still forage in these areas. I will be out surveying and I will have a herd of cattle across the road from me, and there'll be a prairie falcon that's circling above. So there is definitely some coexistence that can happen for sure. To what extent and when there's a tipping point with all of the factors piled on top of each other, we don't know. So.
Okay. And there were a couple of questions about prairie dogs. Are prairie dogs too big a prey item for prairie falcons?
Yeah, so primarily, yes, we get a lot of yellow-bellied marmots out in this landscape and ecosystem. The largest I've ever seen a prairie falcon take is a pigeon, and I've only ever seen that once. So they're sticking to small, and pigeons are much more lightweight than prairie dogs. So they're sticking to relatively smaller, lightweight items for the most part. Won't say it could never happen, like could definitely happen. And I'm never gonna say that it couldn't happen because I think there's a lot we still don't know. I think it for the most part is on the little bit too large of a scale.
Okay. Elizabeth asks, is there a target percentage of shrub or perennial percentages in relation to habitat restoration targets? Would you
Yeah.
recommend targets?
So it's a great question. I am just starting to now kind of delve into the world of restoration. And historically, the NCA, the conservation area, has been a mosaic of sagebrush patches interdispersed with winter fat, which is a food source for a lot of the small mammals. We have on a lot of our cameras that we place out, because we have some placed out in the sagebrush, we have a lot of ground squirrels that forage on winter fat. So a mosaic of, when I said shrub before, shrub can include this sagebrush, it can include winter fat, it can include a variety of different plants, even though this is called a sagebrush steppe landscape. So the sagebrush itself, there's a certain proportion of having a mosaic of sagebrush to winter fat to other native shrubs with forbs and grasses interdispersed within there. I don't know exact percentages off the top of my head. There are those out there who do know that. I could pull that information and follow up if anybody's interested. But that composition of the mosaic of different species is, I think, what is the healthiest landscape out there. So really high levels of sagebrush that are crowding out everything else is also not super healthy in these ecosystems.
Okay, thank you. Elizabeth also asked if you can extrapolate your results to apply to species diversity and carrying capacity.
Yeah, so one of the levels we didn't explore is among populations as well as among species. And so diversity among populations and among species is relatively new in the literature in the last maybe 10 to 15 years. And there's a lot of work that still needs to be done there. I would really love to compare what some of these populations of prairies are doing compared to populations in California and in Utah and up north in Montana and Canada, because we've seen a lot of declines in other populations. And it would be also very interesting to see how these compare to other predator species in the NCA. So ferruginous hawks and golden eagles are two species that currently have active research on them, as well as what other falcon species do. So it would be very interesting to kind of look at the variation in how prairie falcons do things compared to maybe how some other species that use this landscape do things, as well as populations that don't use this landscape but are facing similar issues. How those do these things. We don't have those answers yet, though.
Okay, and just a couple of more questions here. Christina asked if there was plasticity seen in other raptor species too.
Yeah. So plasticity has been documented for, oh gosh, putting my knowledge to the test right now. A number of European species, so there's been another number of studies in Europe done on some plasticity. A majority of the papers, the foundational papers that I've been reading are coming out of Germany. And so there's been quite a bit of work done out there. Outside of specifically behavioral variation, if we want to talk about like things like phenotypic variation in morphology, so like Bryce Robinson's research, and some of the research being done on red-tailed hawks and rough-legged hawks in their color morphology and variation. That's now being very highly documented. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done. This is relatively a new field of study, and especially applying it to movement is relatively new. Within the last 5 years, applying some of this variation in niche theory to movement has been relatively understudied. Most of the papers I've been reading have looked at wading birds and shorebird variation and looking at the overlap in their nesting territories. And then there's been a lot of work, some of the foundational work has been done on songbird populations and variation in chickadees and how their behavioral responses work. And a lot of those experiments have also been done in an experimental setting instead of in a natural setting, or in a combination of the two. So there's still a lot to explore.
Okay, thank you. And this will be the final question, I think. I think we won't get to the camera installation question, which I'm also curious about, Christina. But Neil asks, he mentions past research by Steenhoff et al. From the early 2000s found that prairie falcons from the NCA mostly wintered on the Great Plains, but you mentioned only one of your birds did this. Any thoughts as to why this change in migratory behavior has been observed over the last 20 to 25 years or so?
That's a great question. So I think, yeah, let's pull this map back up. So a lot of the regions that we're seeing them winter in are open grassland planed areas still. And I guess it depends on how you break it down. So if we call it wintering ranges, a majority of our birds actually come back to the NCA to winter. And so the conservation area itself is where a majority of them are spending their like November through up until the breeding season. And we see them doing this kind of northward, westward, eastern, just in the summer. And so I think the prey is the primary factor. So we see the ground squirrels are still out in these areas during the summer. And then once the winter hits and ground squirrels are unavailable for the most part in most places, then prairie falcons are feeding on more birds. And you see a big switch to birds during the winter itself. So when they come back to the conservation area in the winter, there are some ground squirrels that are still out, primarily the males, but they do have to supplement with birds. And so I do think a lot of this is primarily prey driven. I would love to know what the prey compositions are like outside of where we are here, as well as how prey compositions in other areas of the Great Plains have changed. And I think that this may be very different as well for birds that breed south of us. So I'd be very curious to look at if anybody ever puts transmitters out or color bands out on birds that breed in Utah or in Nevada, how they move during the late summer and fall and winter periods. We do know last year, Doug Bell, who is out in California, he put a color band on a bird, on a nestling in the summer last year, and it was photographed in northern Idaho this year during the winter. And so I do really think a lot of this is being driven by prey availability, but then there's also probably some other factors that we don't know yet that would be really interesting to explore.
Wow, a lot of great stuff there to think about, and thanks so much for your comprehensive answers and your passion for the work. I'm going to turn it back over to Julie.
Okay. Yeah, great work, Zoe. Thank you so much. That was a really interesting look at everything you do. It's really fascinating. So best of luck finishing up your research. It sounds like you're going to be doing some more interesting things with your time.
Thanks.
I know we are a few minutes past the hour. I will just add that for next month, our next Lunch and Learn is going to be on June 24th, and we're going to be hearing from Anna Stunkel. She's a researcher and educator that's been hawk watching all over the U.S. She's also an artist, so we're going to do something a little bit different. She's going to be walking us through sketching raptors. So this will be an opportunity to participate and have a chance to kind of sketch raptors along with Anna. So that's kind of fun. Registration is coming soon for that event. And lastly, I will just add that it is Raptorthon season at HMA. We have 11 teams across the country raising money for their local hawk watches and for raptor research and for HMA programming. We are at the height of fundraising right now with lots of teams having their events this week. This is our big spring fundraiser. Phil and I will be doing our Raptorthon up in the White Mountains this weekend. If you have any interest, you can visit hawkmigration.org/Raptorthon and support any of the 11 teams. That would be much appreciated. And thanks everybody for joining today. Great presentation. Thank you again to Zoe. And we hope to see everybody next month. Have a great day.